Welcome to the panel. There's a few more people coming in. Please come in, take the seats at the front. Nobody ever wants to sit at the front, so just sit there. It's okay. You'll have seen our panel's bio when you signed up for this event, but I think it's always nice to let people do their own introductions. So I'm going to throw first to Zoe Cantonotto. Zoe, can you tell us who you are?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I am Zoe Cantonotto, and I am a founder at FutureX, a company on a mission to empower the purposeful. So what we do is we create and curate content for business leaders who want to build sustainable businesses. And we do that through our community, our big events, Nick mentioned Startup Summit, and our online resources. Do you want me to tell more about my background that is relevant to this, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you tell people why you're excited about this topic in particular?
So I'm excited about this topic because I come from Greece. So I grew up in Greece and I moved to Scotland 9 years ago. And as we kind of were chatting before, I was saying that I've done a lot of talks, having a business, you do a lot of talks about business and about kind of like hiring and culture and all those different things, and even diversity for that matter. But there was no one that ever asked me about my identity and about how the experiences that I went through when I moved here, or kind of like everything that I bring with me, how that shaped my view of the world and the way I ran my business. So I'm really excited that I was asked that question, and really excited to share what came up for me to this conversation.
Thanks, Zoe. So we're also joined by Chris Hughes. Chris, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your business and why you are interested in this conversation?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Delighted to be here. So I'm Chris, as Nick said. I'm the founder and CEO of Estendio, and I'm also the chairperson for Skills Development Scotland's Neurodiversity and Tech Group. Essentially, we've created a presentation support software that helps students and people with disabilities deliver a more confident presentation. So I'm dyslexic myself. I had just started a degree at the University of Strathclyde and found I had to give a presentation 2 or 3 times a week. Really struggled with that. Went and met with my disability support team at the university. Said basically, I've really struggled with this. And they said, oh, we hear this all the time. And I was basically told the only support I could get was to either present directly to the lecturer, but if I was really anxious, just to skip it altogether. So I decided that wasn't quite good enough for me. Created my own tool, and it's now being used in over 100 universities across the UK and into America now as well. So I guess when Nick asked me to come along and speak about sort of diversity and inclusion, I think the first thing people think about tends to be gender equality, ethnic equality as well. But I think it is just super important looking at that wider spectrum and just making sure we do have a super balanced society. And that can go in a million different ways. So absolutely delighted to be here and talking about my experience. And yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Okay, we're also joined by Sophie Amundo. Sophie, how are you doing today? Oh no, is Sophie on mute? No, Sophie. The golden rule. Hi, Sophie.
I unmuted myself because I have a really loud, rambunctious laugh. So I was laughing. So I thought I'd put myself on mute so I don't distract everyone. But hello, everyone. I'm Sophie, and I'm the founder of a social media agency based in Edinburgh called Stuffs. I have been in Scotland for 5 fabulous years, although right now I'm in London because as soon as lockdown kind of eased, I was like, I miss my family. I need to get back. But I think there's no better place than my family home to be discussing the topic of identity, because it is so ingrained in my journey as a businesswoman, just me as a person. And what I think the real thing that really touched me about this topic is I think lockdown and what we're seeing with Black Lives Matters, we're understanding that the things that connect us are so similar, and I think we're understanding that the fabric of society is so delicate, so fragile, and we're actually more similar than we are different. This topic is something that I jumped at when Nick spoke to me. I am a parent of two East Ugandan parents, so I've grown up with a very mixed identity. I see myself very much as Ugandan, very much as British, but also now very much Scottish as well. So how does that make sense? Like a melting pot of 3 different cultures that have defined my life. And it's fabulous, like Nick said, that we're having these conversations, because I think a few months ago, with the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, it was in the forefront, it was everywhere. But, you know, as the dust settles, these conversations have a real risk of dying. So I think it's fabulous to see this room, this virtual room, packed with so many people who want to hear more about what diversity means, and us as champions, how we can then go and take very important learnings and messages and apply them to our own businesses, careers, family life. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me and why this topic in particular means so much to me.
Wow, okay, so I think you can tell now that this is going to be a pretty great conversation. Let's get into it. I'd like to set the scene with a quote from the Indian politician and social reformer B.R. Ambedkar. So he says, unlike a drop of water which loses its identity when it joins the ocean, man does not lose his being in the society in which he lives. Man's life is independent. He is born not of the development of the society alone, but for the development of his self. So without getting into the whole pronouns, gendered side of that, I think that's a really interesting place to start off. So we're discovering tonight how people's experiences have empowered their journeys. And I'd like to start with you, Zoe. You touched on it in your introduction. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience of coming to Scotland?
Yes. So I kind of, like, as I said before, I grew up in Greece, and I did my undergrad in Greece. So I studied finances, and then in 2011, when I was 23, I moved to Scotland to do a master's in Sterling on international business and socioeconomic development. And for me, one of the big things that I carried with me coming from Greece was the impacts of the economic crisis. The crisis happened in 2008. I started studying in 2006. So it was a fascinating time studying finances during the collapse of the world economic system, and of course the massive impact that had in the Greek economy. And for me, that shaped a lot the idea of what and how businesses, what the role of the businesses is to help and to positively impact the world. So that's why I came to Scotland saying, I saw this master's, it was about socioeconomic development, and I was like, here it is, there's this solution. And I finished that. I went to look for a job, and I started as the first employee in a company that was working with entrepreneurs to help them fully connect with a purpose. And it was all about finding the why. And for me, what I was really excited about moving to Scotland was that I definitely felt very welcomed. I think that was my experience. For me, it was a very welcoming environment. It was a very understanding environment. It was tricky. I had to start everything fresh. Like, I've left everyone behind. I left my family, my friends. I was 23. I was just starting. I think being in a university context was helpful because you had the support system there. But even when I moved to Edinburgh, and it was difficult times, and I didn't have a job, and it was dark, the first winter in Scotland, I still felt that my experience was that everyone was very positive and very welcoming, and in that feeling, like, I never felt strange. I felt embraced.
And how do you think, seeing what that economic turmoil did to Greece, how has that kind of shaped how you see perhaps what's going on now with the grants and the kind of upheaval that people have, and perhaps people venting and complaining about not getting opportunities here? Do you think there's a different dynamic in Scotland from that?
I think now it's kind of like, obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic, and like no one knows no one could predict what happened and what will happen, and it's all uncertain. But I think starting a business here, and even when I was working in a business, I was managing a business, we usually have these conversations with people when they will come and complain and say, you know, oh, we don't have support here, or there's no networks. And I was like, oh, you have no idea how lucky you are. Because I have friends in Greece that they tried to set up a business for 4 years because they couldn't, like the regulations will change every 3 months and they will need new paperwork. So for 4 years, they would just try to set up and get the registration number to start a business. And I was like, I just can go online and do that. And then it's kind of like this feeling that you take some things for granted. So for me, it gave me that perspective that there is a lot, and our job is to utilize that. Our job is to connect that, is to learn more about this and not take it for granted and think for more. The current situation is a bit different because obviously I think this is like a world situation, and there's definitely demand for a lot more support and a lot more interjections. But I think in general, the business ecosystem, from where I come from, the business ecosystem in Scotland is very supported and very well connected.
Before we jump to our next question from Martine, it is something that I've noticed from talking to people within Startup Ground from different communities around Europe, around the world. I feel like it is a USP of Scotland's in terms of our network and our connectivity, and how quickly and willingly people in Scotland can get you in front of the person that you need for that problem. As a kind of pseudo outsider, do you feel that that is like a bit of a cultural trait of people within Scotland, and have you absorbed that yourself?
Yes, I do think that it's a cultural thing, and I think that's how I found my first job. I had around the first TEDx Glasgow, and then a couple of months later I got a call from the curator saying, I know this person that is looking for someone, I think you should meet them. And it was like that willingness to help me and say, you know something, I know someone that works for you. I think I've seen that as a trait. I think you see that in different countries as well. Probably in Greece is quite similar, but I think that people have different motives in a way. Like they expect something, they're like behaving that way because they think that something will come back the way. I think in Scotland, I've seen that people are willing to help.
So interesting. You got a question for Sophie, Martine?
Yeah, actually it goes into the same vein of question you're asking, because Sophie, I remember you said you're not also from Scotland. You've been here just for 5 years. I think almost everyone is not from Scotland. Great. So can you please tell us a bit more about your experience growing up and getting into work, and how basically that shaped into who you are as a businesswoman and living in Scotland?
Yeah, definitely. So growing up, I grew up in London, the East End of London. It's not the cool hipster part at all. Very working class. But my parents came here in the late 80s as refugees, economical migrants as well. So they found work. And it was instilled in me very early on that the reality that as a young girl who would grow to be a Black woman in this society, that you would face racism. And just imagine this for anyone who isn't a person of color. Imagine being a child and hearing this conversation, like you are going to have it tougher. But our parents had to have this conversation with us. So I grew up, knowing that I was probably, very likely going to face, a harder time getting the career I wanted. But one thing my parents, especially my mum, an amazing, powerful woman, a mum of 5 children, she just instilled in us that you can be anything you want in this world. I remember at 7, I was like, I'm going to be the first Black woman in space. That changed quickly because I have a fear of heights. I was like, yeah, go to the moon is going to have to involve a lot of heights. So I got rid of that one. But she just instilled in me this really entrepreneurial spirit that don't let where you are from, your means, hold you back. So I grew up with this fire in my belly that, look, it's going to be hard, but you're aware of it now. So go out and get it, girl. And I think that really instilled this spirit of, if you can't find a way, make one. And then studied media in London. Very, very fortunate. I worked at some great organisations like News of the World. At the time was this Red Top magazine. So I was involved in making that digital. the Sun digital, ooh, I know, and then the Times, the Sunday Times, making them all digital. And it was such a great time in London. You know, digital industry was just taken off, but I burnt out. I am a, you know, self-confessed workaholic, and I just burnt out, you know, finishing work at 1 a.m, starting again. I just thought, this can't carry on. And a very well-timed or mistimed train journey to Scotland. So we were going up to climb Ben Nevis, and true Londoners, we just rocked up at Glasgow Queen Street and we're like, yeah, we'll have 4 tickets to Ben Nevis, please. And they were like, yeah, it's Fort William and you've missed the last train. And I spent the night in Glasgow speaking to people, and I just realized that in London, people don't speak to each other. You know, I'd grown a really successful career in kind of like media and digital marketing, but I didn't speak to anyone. Like, you could be going about your day and everyone's just so heads down, you know, work, work, work. And there was just something so refreshing that people wanted to speak to me, that I knew one day I would be back in Scotland. And I moved up to Edinburgh kind of 4 years after that trip, and I've never looked back since. And I think when I first came to Scotland, I identified very much as a Londoner, you know, that fast getting culture, but the kind of openness that my parents had always instilled with me, you know, treat everyone else how you would like to be treated. I think, like Zoe was saying, I found that although I was the new kid in town, especially in marketing, the creative agency world, people really did accept me for who I was. But then I had to face the stark reality, and I want to be very open and honest with everyone today. I had to face the stark reality that I was constantly the only Black woman in the room. I was also a gobby Londoner with a big mouth that, you know, challenged people. You know, if I didn't think something was right, I would say, and that got me into a lot of trouble in agency land. People don't like you pointing out their flaws. So eventually I just thought, I'm going to start my own agency. I don't see people like me. There is no discussion about helping more people like me into this industry. Again, like I said, that childhood stubbornness that my parents had instilled in me, I just thought, I'm going to start my own agency. So I think now, the very things that I guess when I was younger, I was kind of like, oh, I just want to be like everyone else, as a founder has made me very unique, because I am this East African Londoner who identifies now as Scottish, running this agency. And I think it just makes, it's like a superpower, you know, the very things that I probably was quite ashamed of growing up. Now I'm like, this is brilliant. This makes me a great founder of a marketing agency. So that's a little bit about how I've ended up here, Martine.
Great.
So I'm gonna jump about the format a bit. So sorry, Martine. Chris, I don't want to leave you out here. I think this is an interesting time to bring you in.
I think I can't follow that. That was sorry, I was sitting in awe.
I mean, you've got a very different experience being a Scottish-born white male, but it's interesting that Sophie used that term superpower there. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your experiences growing up with dyslexia, and maybe how that prompted you to start your own business rather than be an employee somewhere?
Yeah, I think something that really resonated that Sophie was literally just saying was having that fire in your belly, and I think that does come with, you know, does come down to that kind of pride in your identity and pride in kind of being, you know, different, so to speak, you know, in terms of, like, obviously I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was around 12. Before that, you know, I was always, you know, a headache for teachers as to why, you know, I wasn't performing in class. You know, I could answer questions well, but could never grade well. And then even all the way throughout school, I was in support for learning with my dyslexia. Teachers couldn't really understand why I was struggling, because on paper I was pretty bright, but yeah, I think for me, what was quite telling is I'd always dreamt of going to uni, and both my parents went to uni, and I always wanted to go to university, but I was told that wasn't really a realistic dream. So I was kind of told, right, let's get you a trade, son. And I was like, oh, not really what I want to do, but yeah, I'll try. But no, I think for myself, I had a bit of a light bulb moment when I was about 15, 16, and I just realized, I'm going to have to work harder than everyone else to actually learn. I am going to have to put in twice the graft here. I'm going to have to work until like 11, 12 o'clock at night. And this was as like a 15, 16-year-old. So I did really have that fire in my belly to actually try and like hit a goal which I thought was unachievable, which was getting to uni. I know from the grander scheme of things, there's obviously much harder tasks, but for me, like in my situation, that hurdle was actually trying to get to a university place, which I thought was on paper completely unachievable. And I think that kind of fire in my belly, which I think is such a great term Sophie used, is really something that's resonated with me in terms of starting my business. And that's really why I started my business, was that kind of drive to, like I'd worked my arse off to get to uni. And then when I actually got to uni, I was kind of told I had to give this presentation, and I really struggled with it. There was nothing that could actually help me deliver a better presentation other than constant prep. But essentially there was nothing that could be a kind of quick fix. And I could have just skipped it and just completely skipped that life skill, but just looking at the employability, communication is such an important life skill. And I thought, if I don't nail this while I'm at university and get this full experience, which I worked so hard to get here for, what's the point? It's, in terms of people with disabilities, I think only about 20% of people like myself with a disability are in any form of employment. So that is a massive, massive kind of gap there. So I was looking at that, and I was just kind of thinking to myself, if I don't nail this, then it's going to be such a challenge for me actually getting a job. And yeah, that's really kind of where that started for me.
So I think one of the themes I'd like to touch on is like this idea of being an outsider and feeling like you're not getting a chance to be included. And when we talk about inclusion now, it's so much more than a hashtag. And I think the difference between diversity and inclusion is diversity is your people and their gifts and their situation. And inclusion is about creating a dynamic where everyone can feel comfortable enough to contribute and where everyone has a fair chance to grow and achieve in whatever they want to pursue. So I'd like to ask all of you one by one, like what do you think the positives and negatives are from your personal situations of feeling like an outsider? And we'll start with Zoe.
I kind of like wondering why you said we're asking this question. For me, it has been a journey since I moved here, because as I said, like everything in Scotland was very welcoming, and I fortunately in that sense didn't have the experience of Sophie. I didn't have anything, but it was in my mind quite a lot. I would feel different. I would feel the outsider because of what I was thinking and what I was bringing with me. And that was a different culture. I had this massive constant fear of being misunderstood and of not being able to express myself through language, and saying the wrong thing. I would not be able to say my opinion because I thought that, I might not be able to express it the way I should and people don't understand it. Or people would consider me rude because European people are more direct, and I'll just say something and be like, oh, that was harsh, or why are you rude to that person? It's like, I don't want to. So there was a lot of like, when I came here, even everyone was welcoming and everyone was like trying to help me, I felt very conscious of my being an outsider. And I think that was difficult in the beginning. That was the negative. The negative was the weight I put on myself to trying to match up with everyone, to trying to fit in. I was kind of like trying to pick up on what people were saying, and the way that harmed my own self-confidence, my own belief in what I can do. But I think the positive for me is exactly what kind of Sophie said, which is the moment you embrace that and the moment you realize that this is an advantage. And I think that was the positive, when I realized that, no, I bring a different experience with me. I bring this openness, I bring this open-mindedness. I've seen other things you don't know. And it's not only coming from Grace, I'm a woman in business, and I bring that as well. And instead of that being a negative thing, instead of that being, good enough, suddenly became, but I bring empathy and I bring compassion and I bring all these elements that suddenly make things better. And once I realized that, and I got more comfortable with the idea of the things that were maybe not the same, like I still might not be able to express myself the best way and I choose the wrong words, but that is not stopping me now, because I take that as a positive, and I take that, this is my advantage.
Sophie, can you resonate with that about being kind of comfortable with your own otherness in a new climate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you go out into a new environment, it can do one of two things. It can cement all of the things about yourself that maybe before you didn't love. Actually, I'm really proud of these things. Or it could make you push them down further. And for me, what I found as a real positive is I really began to stand in who Sophie was. I began to understand those values that are entrenched in me culturally, in how I've been brought up, in the things that I'm passionate about, diversity and inclusion, representation. I realized that those things really matter to me, and they matter so much that I'm not willing to work for another organization, another agency where those things are not high on their radar, because they have their own set of values. But for me, I was like, these are my values, and therefore I'm never going to be ashamed about wanting that first, But I think it also allows you to look at problems differently. And I think that's great, because there's enough space in this startup world for everyone. And I think if you're coming as an outsider, or like Chris said, neurodiverse way of looking at the world, you look at problems differently. So you have a different solution that you can offer clients, a different work experience that you can offer in the workplace. So I think those are kind of the positives. But I think the negatives are, you are going to have to fight that a little bit harder, and it can be physically and mentally exhausting. If you are the different person, if you are the different business, if you do hold the different values, and you're not just about the money, you can sometimes feel like, oh, should I just sell out and be like everyone else? Because you are sometimes fighting a losing battle, getting people to believe in the things that you believe in. So I think anyone that's actively working the diversity or inclusion space, or is passionate about it, or like many of us here, Chris and Zoe, you do sometimes just get so exhausted, because it's like, oh, I'm constantly having to prove that I can do it,
You've got three different things there that I could jump to, but I'm going to go with one because I've got another couple coming up. Now, Chris, Sophie just mentioned gifts and feeling comfortable with your gifts. And we've got Chris is joining me on a different webinar for AAI talking about neurodiversity and disability and employment. But Chris, could you maybe talk to us a little bit about the different gifts that different neurodiverse conditions can bring to the workplace, and how people should feel comfortable and champion their own inherent gifts?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And, like yourself, Nick, I think Sophie kind of touched upon some really, really great kind of key messages there, which I could have jumped on as well. I think just answering your question there, I think one of the roles that I'm really focusing in on in the kind of chair position that I've got with Skills Development Scotland's Neurodiversity and Tech Group is really just the education piece around neurodiversity, for example. And that is all about why we need a nice diverse workforce. And for example, one of the things that's very hot just now is this whole tech sector in Scotland. Obviously, Mark Logan had his report, which came out a few weeks ago. And one of the big skills gap is obviously in the software side of things. And I think one of the jobs that we're trying to push from Skills Development Scotland's point of view is just a basic education on different neurodivergencies, in terms of really educating potential employers. For example, people with ASD or autism have fantastic skill sets to be software developers. People with dyslexia, like myself, very creative and very determined. People with ADHD are great problem solvers as well. So that's one of the things that we're trying to push really hard as an organisation. Just touching upon the earlier side of things, which Sophie absolutely hit the nail on the head on, I feel like coming back to kind of coming in as an outsider, again, there's not much that I can really relate or I can talk about that the guys haven't covered. Obviously, dyslexia is an invisible kind of disability. I think it really is more just that mental block I think the biggest thing that I could really talk about was the fact that I was 19 when I started the business, and it was almost like having this chip in your shoulder. You had to prove yourself.
Yeah.
And I think you then put more pressure on yourself because you feel like you have something to prove. And so when I was 19, and I felt like I had to dress properly, like in like a blazer and shirt and trousers every day. You're kidding yourself on. I feel like at that point, I mean, I can only talk about my experience from that side of things as a very young entrepreneur. So I can't imagine it must be a lot harder from the guys' experience than myself. But I just felt like I had something to prove, and then it's just that constant pressure that you put on yourself was a real big thing.
Now, Martine, you've also come to Scotland, so I'm interested to know what your experience is as a student for this.
As a student at Scotland, definitely it's multicultural. Everyone is from everywhere, which was great because I didn't want to be in a place where I'm coming to stay here for 4 years and I will feel like an outsider all the time. And so everyone is from everywhere, different countries. So that was really great and welcoming in that sense. But things start get different because you are, personally, I'm the type of the different outsider. Not only I'm Black, African, and I'm a woman, but also I'm the Black African, meaning I realize there is level of otherness and there is level of minorities. So when you are a minority among the minority and you are the other among others, so where people would be like, oh, your accent is not British. So then they start, of course, then assimilating some negative stereotype about me, saying, oh, you must be poor. How does it like to grow in wars? I'm like, in poverty. And they start assuming all those things because that's what they see about being like an African. And then of course it's we have to get used to lots of microaggressions from everywhere, from school, from outside uni. For instance, like this thing happens a lot. For instance, like the tutor will be that was the first thing they would ask. They would tell people, if Martine can actually contribute to this topic, definitely you have something to say. I'm like, so I'm the lowest. I'm the lowest actually, like, of intelligence. And they would say things like that. If I say a comment, they're like, oh, aren't you African? I'm like, yes, so how do you know? Yeah, so all those kind of microaggressions, so you get used to that. And so, but then there is this thing of like racial illiteracy and lack of awareness in Scotland, and everyone just go through it, like that type of blindness. So think there is no discrimination, everyone is happy. And so I was really happy that the topic of Black Lives Matter came up, so that we actually finally break the ceiling, because that's when it started getting into trouble and people starting to actually take sides. And when we started Black Ed movement, for instance, we had people telling us to go back to our country, to never come back to Scotland, saying, oh, this Black student coming to our country to try to change us, or get some attack on the Black Lives Matter march. So that's when you start seeing actually, oh, there can be discrimination if we go past the blindness about about others. So I guess it was positive, but also negative. But it gets negative when you actually want to provoke and get into trouble. So I really resonate with Sophie when she said that.
So I mean, I think we all like to think of Scotland as this very inclusive and multicultural place. If we look at something like Brexit, and not to wash over Black Lives Matter, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But if we look at Brexit, perhaps, so, you know, Martine mentioned there this expectation of contribution. Is that something you felt as well?
Yes, and I think it's interesting because, and I think that's like where my experience comes in. Before Brexit, before the conversation started, I've never felt that in Scotland. I had felt that in England. I was actually in London on the subway with my sister talking in Greek, and there was someone going like, you're not British, go back to your country. while we're chatting, and you're like, that is like, you know, like we could like anything, it was suddenly shouting at us. And for me that was very difficult because I never heard like that in Scotland. And then the Brexit conversation happened, and I think Martina's point was brilliant, because it's when we suddenly provoke, suddenly we have to take sides, and suddenly when that happens, you can see that people expect more. Suddenly you have to prove yourself a bit more. I'm here, I'm from Europe, but I pay taxes, but I have a business, but I contribute, but like I have a meaning. It's like up to me to prove that I have a worth here, and that's why I should stay, rather than just to have the argument that you should go back to your country. No, but I have things to contribute, rather than it doesn't matter. I'm here because everyone is here. But it's kind of like on another perspective, because you're talking about multicultural, and I think that's also something that I can break from Greece, which is like, for me, Greece is lacking a lot on diversity in the conversation. I think Greece is more racism because, and generalizing a bit, because there's such a lack of diversity, that people don't even talk about that, because there's no one like different than them. And suddenly you'd see now what is happening with all the refugees. So suddenly now you have this conversation, oh, we see them. Up to now, everyone thought that this is like the blindness on a different perspective. No, they don't exist, so we don't have a problem. So is us understanding where this blindness happens, and how we can have all this conversation, especially when we're polarized, like a society, we're polarized, and we're not able to have a dialogue to understand exactly what it is, and we put people into a position to have to prove themselves and their worth. It doesn't make sense.
No, it does. And I think it talks a lot to the inclusion conversation in terms of not hate or of fear of a certain type of otherness, but just a kind of ignorance, like you don't know what you don't know. And this is why it's so important to have these frank and open conversations to kind of embrace the awkward and bring different voices to the table, and to talk about people's experiences, because it's very hard from your own position of privilege, whatever that might be, to entertain someone else's life experiences and what baggage they might be bringing to the table in a certain situation.
And sorry, can I add something, Nick? I know,
yeah.
But it's like, for me, one of the things with conversations, this conversation needs to be open. It needs to be coming with a humility that I don't know. For me, this is important. This is what I found difficult sometimes, having conversations like this, because I don't want to be saying the wrong thing, but I would love to be able to come with, this is what I don't know. But one of the things that for me, something that I carry with all my life experience, is that I have a bigger version of for assumptions. And Anna is laughing. Sorry, Anna is on my team, and she knows that this is like a fundamental thing in our business, that I hate assumptions. And the reason I hate assumption is because of that experience, because of that someone assumes something of you, and they make a judgment and they make a decision. And I think for me, we want to start talking about diversity. We need to start thinking that everyone is diverse because no one has exactly the same life experience. So all the assumptions we make can be wrong, and we need to approach conversations without these assumptions and without anything, and be like, okay, I'm just here to listen. And I think only when we achieve that, we'll be able to understand a bit better who else is in the room and what we can do to help each other.
Okay, I've got something for this. And Reham, who's on the call, will enjoy this, because we use this in our Diversity Works program. And it's this idea that the pandemic, right, a lot of people thought, oh, it's a great equalizer, it's a great leveler, but it's anything but. And I really hope that one of the messages that we don't forget from this pandemic when we're checking in with people is to recognize that, yes, we're all in the same storm, we're in the same ocean, but we're not all in the same boat. We're all in different boats. And my boat might have an engine, and your boat's got one oar. Your boat might have a whole load of passengers. Your boat might have loads of holes in it. And it's this idea of not making assumptions of how people are. And this for me is one of the huge person-centric approaches that society has, when we realized how interdependent we were, so that when we check in with each other now, it's not just, oh, how you doing? Yeah, I'm fine. It's a genuine check-in to say, like, I can't assume what you're going through, so please tell me. And that is an energy which could carry forward to a much more positive and inclusive society if we can keep with it. Would you agree? Anyone?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to get more into that later, and I'm a person who likes to take small talk to big talk quite quickly, and I love that you guys are on board with this in your own boats. But we're going to talk about gender. So Martine, could you kick us off with this?
Sure. I like what Zoe talked about those like dialogues being like needed to be held, and sometimes I think we bring in some movements and people take them as just tick boxes, and they jump on them and they leave them. And so one of them, of course, is gender. We have taken on that fight for lots of years, and but talking about implicit bias, talking about explicit bias, I'm sure that we still have a long way to go, and in still 2020. And I would really love to hear your thoughts for Zoe and Sophie about being a woman in business these days. Right now, we're talking 2020. How is it?
Yeah, yeah, I think we've also over the weekend the really sad passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and when you read what she did for women in, you know, a very, you know, you can't even put into words how spectacular her life was. But, you know, things like women being able to have mortgages for themselves, have credit cards for themselves, like this is so ingrained and entrenched in society that you read those things, and because we, you know, we've had the Me Too movement, women in leadership, women in business, we tend to think that we've come so far. But when you read those things and you're looking at, this was just 10, 20, 30 years ago, you couldn't even have a credit card for yourself. We've all seen, I think it was Apple, I'm not sure, where the algorithm was scoring women with better credit scores than men and turning them down. It's so ingrained in society that you see that it's just everything, you know, goes against it. And I think a great way to start is actually as women, and for men to understand, you know, the burden that women are having to fight across, and to support and uplift women, and to sometimes men just zip it. Let the women talk, because women have not had that opportunity to talk. And I think for a lot of women are suffering from so much ingrained misogynism that they don't even feel that it's okay to have a voice. So I think what we need to do as a society is start encouraging women to speak up, even if their voices shake, even if they're uncomfortable, because they've had millennia of not having their voices heard. And I think that starts at school age, it works at every stage of the corporate ladder. It's like, how do we instill in women that it's okay to speak up, and it's okay to express your voice, and it's okay for men to allow women to lead. It doesn't make you any less of a man. If anything, it makes you more of a man in my eyes, but everyone's slightly different. And to address that balance, you know, between the genders. And I think it does start with people having their voices heard and having their voices respected. And I think when you look at the life of Ruth, you see that she was someone, when you see kind of how she was in the Supreme Court, she was a woman who, you know, was at one point, you know, the one female Supreme Court judge in there, in a vast room of very, you know, privileged men who have always been heard, and she just fought her corner, and you can see the reverberant effect of what that did. So I think we just need to have more women speaking up, instilling that confidence in them, and then men's taking a backseat and listening, and knowing that, you know, it can be threatening. You know, you think that, oh, the women are coming to take over, but I think if the male gender really want to succeed, they need to do it with women as their equals, standing side by side with them.
Wow, follow that, Zoe.
I know. Definitely, I definitely echo everything you said, Sophie. I think for me, like the weekend was an interesting experience personally, because I was very emotional all weekend, and my fiance was trying to be very supportive and trying to understand what happened. And I was like, I don't think you can ever understand, because it's this feeling that if it wasn't for her and women like her, my life would be so different. And I can feel it in my bones. They can feel that there is those things that we have and we take for granted that was fought for not that long ago. And we definitely need to continue and push for that. I will add one more thing to what you said about allowing women to speak and allowing women to take the position and lead. I would say allow women to fail, because I think that is, for me, that is important. I feel like sometimes there is this burden that we carry to make sure that we are these role models, that we are the successful women that people can see, so they can be inspired by. And that sometimes is unbearable, is this feeling that I'm not allowed to fail. And I personally feel I'm very lucky to have a co-founder who's a male and is a feminist, and I feel very supported. I've been having all these conversations, and I think going back to these conversations of understanding someone else's perception and being able to say, I had no idea I was like this, but I take your word for it. I'm not going to push for it. I think that if that's what you experience, that's what it is. In my life, I had experienced that wasn't the case. I had colleagues who patronized me. I had colleagues who were trying to put me out by putting themselves down just to make them equal, which is definitely not the right thing to do. But for me, I still have this feeling inside me that I don't have the same kind of like wavelength to fail. I still feel that I need to succeed. I need to be able to become this role model because I want women to see that this is possible. So I want women to be able to speak up, to fail, to try again like everyone else. I read like somewhere that, you know, if a woman fails and suddenly it's like, oh, you know, maybe woman is not good at being in business or in leadership position. But no one actually ever questioned why all white men, like bankers, led to the economic crisis, saying, maybe they're not good enough for this position. Maybe we should try something else. And I think for me, we will be able to achieve that kind of equality where we get to the space that we're all allowed to fail and try without feeling all these consequences on us. I will have to say though, like being in business for 8 years, I have seen difference and I have seen change for the positive. So I think we need to continue that. Like 8 years ago, when I go into a meeting, everyone will think I was a secretary. Like there was no question. Like no one will speak to me. No one will think I have something to say. And now that's not as common. It still happens sometimes, but definitely not as common. And there is an element of me being able to embrace that and not allowing that. I don't wait anymore to being introduced. I'll just jump in and say, this is who I am. So there's definitely progress, but there's so much more we can do and so much more that we have to work towards.
Sophie, do you feel that certain pressure of expectation to be a positive representation of female leadership in business?
Oh, absolutely. And it's actually led to my mental health suffering so bad because you feel like you've got to be perfect. You have to have all the answers and you can't own up and say, I've got it wrong, I messed up. You know, you feel this weight and no one can bear the weight of perfectionism. We're just humans. We will get it wrong. And getting things wrong is great because it teaches you more about yourself. You can learn in things going wrong. But I had to take a step back in August because I was like, this is too much pressure on me to always, you know, be like, I am this strong, powerful woman. But you can be all those things, but you can also be compassionate and you can also be shy and you can also need time out. And I think it's really important, just as humans, that we look at the whole of what makes a human, you know, especially in business. I think sometimes we think that people are a bit like machines, you know, they go, and they get everything perfect and they win this sales pitch. But it's like, if you look at the whole of humanity, you know, what makes someone human, it's that whole breadth of feelings. You know, sometimes you feel sad, dejected, you feel alone, and we should allow people to embrace that. And I think if you embrace it as a woman, it's like, oh, she's just being a woman. And I think if you embrace it as a man, it's like, oh, he's a weak leader. But it's like, no, we're just humans. We're just being human. We're just being what our very DNA says that we should be. So I think appreciating the whole complexity of our emotional, you know, wavelength and our mental capacity will really help. And I think when we have these conversations about equality, diversity, championing different identities, I think it is also identifying that there are some things that in business particularly that are seen as negatives, you know, and it leads to, you know, most startups will tell you about startup or founder burnout, where you just burn out. You feel like you have to do everything and you have to do it now. And if the whole world's watching, especially in the social media world, like I love it, but the whole world's watching, and if you mess it up, and it's just so much pressure. I think we just need to embrace those other parts of what being a human is. And it is lost, it's failure, as COVID has taught us. It's some of those things that we've always thought are not so nice, but actually just make us human.
So before we move on to disability, I want to try and wrap up this bit about gender. I mean, obviously we could have a whole event about gender, but we've talked about supporting women and being a role model for women. But do you feel there's still this idea of women not supporting each other in business. Sophie.
Yeah, I think that's definitely changed. I think when I first started my career, women were pitted against each other. It's like, she's your competition, because there's only ever allowed to be one woman as head of the table. But I think and this is the great thing about social media, I think what social media has done is made women realize that we're all in this together. We all have this lived experience. We're all facing the same thing. And, you know, go on social media, I've met so many amazing women on there, and men as well across Scotland, who are like, you know, you should speak to Sophie, like Nick's really great, like, you know, you should speak to this person. But I do think there was, I can't lie, there was definitely this feeling of, you know, there can only ever be one woman. And I think, you know, without turning it into a bit of like a look at cultural media, I think if you look at kind of like films when we were growing up, you know, you had the head girl and everyone fell between it. There was only ever allowed to be one woman at the top, you know, and I think that is very dangerous. But I think what's happening is we are having this camaraderie of women coming together and be like, actually, let's lift each other up. I think the danger with those things is that there's this term girl boss, and it started off, it's still a very positive movement, but it can quickly become very elitist, you know. And I think Zoe slightly touched on it as well. It's like the only women that really matter are those that kind of trailblazing, who are, you know, out there at the front, at the forefront. But there are like single mothers who are holding society together, stay-at-home mums, and their job is just as important as the woman speaking at Startup Grind Edinburgh today. Like my mum, I would not be here without my mum, you know, choosing to be a stay-at-home mum and do what she did. So I think, you know, I'm a realist, and I think what women need to do is also remember, you know, in our fight for equality and feminism, is to bring all women with us. And it's not just, like Zoe said, the women who are out there leading their fantastic businesses. It's also the women who are doing just as much of an important job at home, the dinner ladies. They're just as important.
Oh, absolutely. Anything to add to that, Zoe?
Yes, just kind of like a slight different perspective to that. Can you, is it?
Yeah.
In terms of kind of like my experience, I found that as a young businesswoman, which was very interesting for me, there was definitely a lot of support, and there was definitely a lot of support for women to come together and help. I found that the competition was with women from older generation. And I'm kind of like talking about like 50, that kind of age. And it kind of like, it gave me this feeling that it was this thing that it was so hard for me and it's so easy for you right now. And I think that is also something for us to remember. And it's like, as Sophie said, we need to bring everyone with us. And for me, this is not a point of, oh yeah, that's wrong. It's more of a point of, we all come from different experiences, and their experience is different from my experience, exactly because there was a lot of things that changed in between, and how we can embrace that to make sure that we all come together.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, I see it myself. You know, my boss, Joy Lewis, is from a slightly older generation, and she went through that culture in the workplace where women weren't seen, and even calling someone like that a trailblazer for starting their own company is like slightly patronizing. You know, I hate to see things where they celebrate female entrepreneurs, because like where I'm coming from, we call them entrepreneurs, right? And I think there are benefits to having all female accelerators, like Sophie said, where you can work collaboratively and break down those perceived barriers between women. But I also think it's problematic to put them in their own special box and label them sometimes. Am I getting it wrong?
No, I would agree. I think there is, like you said, a point to be like, actually, for visibility, like this is an entrepreneur and hey, she's a female, it does happen. But I think then you can be boxed. So for example, you know, male entrepreneurs, they make loads of money and, you know, they're hyper successful and they scale up very fast. And I think Cindy Gallop, who's a great champion, and she says, you know, to women, make a ton of money, women, like, and she, you know, champions women starting their own marketing agencies, because again, it's this perception that male entrepreneurs, you know, they they invent the next big thing, and the women, what they do is they do these lovely jobs that changes the world that we live in, which is just a reflection of those gender stereotypes, isn't it? It's just changed again. So I think, yeah, I think in some ways it can help, because it's like, hey, here's an entrepreneur and she's a woman, you didn't expect it. But it changes, you know, the perception of, it can pigeonhole people. And I think we need to get to that stage where, like I said, entrepreneur is entrepreneur because they have a great product and a great service, and women can make a ton of money if they choose to. And if they don't want to, men can also, if they don't want to make a ton of money. But I think these labels that we have on what entrepreneurship looks like for men and women are just actually reflections of bygone, or what we thought were bygone areas. They're just now in business.
So Alan, our tech guy, that's definitely a clip where we're going to cut and use as a shorter version. There's a nod for you. So speaking of male entrepreneurs with great products and great services, thanks for setting me up there, Sophie. Chris, now I told Chris to bring some snacks tonight, and he actually did, because there was going to be a lot of the talk that he might not be able to jump into. But Chris, I want to bring you back, so put down the gummy bears and tell us, we're going to talk about disability and neurodiversity, because as we've seen tonight, there's a lot of conversations underneath this diversity and inclusion banner. And of course, this year has been very much about civil rights and racism, and gender equality has always been at the front of people's minds in terms of workplace dynamics. And my question to you to start off with is, do you feel like the disability and neurodiversity conversation has not been at the forefront of people's minds in this conversation?
I think everything's relative, Nick, in terms of, obviously, you know, like we obviously had, you know, from the civil rights perspective, that's obviously been very, very hot just now, and there has been a massive reaction. It's really important that we are having this conversation and we can try and do something about that. This is a society. I think obviously COVID, one of the things that we haven't talked about is just how people with disabilities have adapted to remote working. And I think maybe it has opened some people's eyes, but obviously there's just been so much that's been happening culturally, which has just completely changed the world that we live in over the last 6 months. For example, I mean, right now we are on a Zoom call. If someone who is calling in or wanting to be part of this who is hard of hearing or deaf, they would have a very different experience to what we are experiencing right now. I know people, for example, who have Usher syndrome, so that is, you're blind and deaf, so it'd be almost impossible for some people to access even this kind of conversation in the first place. And they could be a woman and they could be black as well. So they're ticking all the boxes in terms of diversity. So I think it's something that as a society we just need to be moving towards, is just creating a world that everyone does have that kind of equity, that sort of level playing field. Everyone has the same access and opportunities. I think just what Sophie and Zoe were touching upon earlier was really, really powerful, and there's nothing that I can add from that perspective. I think I can only try and imagine kind of that particular challenge in terms of what those guys have been through. But speaking from, you know, someone with a disability, I think, you know, there's a lot of room that we still need to look at, and I think it is just a basic education piece. And it is then creating a more balanced work team. But I think looking at the kind of gender and ethnic side of things, that is obviously a lot it's a lot wider, I guess. I mean, roughly about 10% of people with disability in the world has a disability. So I guess in the balance of this conversation, we then need to be looking at the balance of that diversity.
So you mentioned before, Chris, that the Mark Logan, ex-Skyscanner CEO and investor and startup guru, for those who don't know it, he published a report recently backed by the Scottish Government about the tech ecosystem in Scotland. And one of the things that he focused on was this inclusion of people with disabilities and the gifts that they could bring to tech companies in that report. Do you feel that there's still this kind of fear of the unknown around approaching the conversation of hiring people with disabilities?
Spot on, Nick. I mean, you'll know from the AAI experience in terms of the hiring process for people with disabilities is still very, very, very kind of, there's such a lack of knowledge around, for example, providing the opportunity for having a workplace adjustment. So, for example, for someone with a disability, being able to request the questions before the interview so that they can prepare. Someone has autism, for example, being able to say, you know, I might not be able to make eye contact in this interview, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be a terrible person for this role or even for this company. And it's just building up this general awareness. And I think it's just an education piece. So, for example, being a disability confident employer. So it's a disability confident employer is a great scheme, which I would strongly encourage everyone to look at. You know, it's, for me, it's as important as being committed to living wage and kind of gender equality pay. You know, I think it's super important that you are committed to encouraging everyone an equal and totally fair opportunity and process to apply for a role. I was speaking at an HR event 6 or 7 months, or it was just before COVID. I'm not going to name it just in case, just to save any embarrassment. But this was an HR event, which there was HR directors, HR managers, and I was talking about being a disability confident employer, and it was well over the head of HR. Someone was like, "Oh, you used the term being disability confident employer. That's really cool. Did you just make that up?" I'm like, "No, I didn't make that up. No." You know, I didn't make that up. No, I mean, these are the HR directors and HR managers, and I feel like it is something that is obviously there's a lot more in your face and very kind of. A lot needs to be changed in society, and this is something that can be quite easily kind of just brushed under the carpet, but it is something that it does affect so many people as well. And it is just, as a society, we need to be moving towards creating this world where everyone has the same chances and the same opportunities.
It's a topic that we're going to get into when Kristen joins me on my webinar on the 9th of October. I'll drop a link to the chat where we're embracing the awkward and having these questions answered. You know, the fact that Disability Confident is a free accreditation that a business can get, and so many people don't know about it. When you're applying for a job and you do have a disability and you see that logo on the job advert, it's almost like a green light to know that you're going to be accepted, you're going to be met, your requests for the additional support that you mentioned to interview are not going to be scoffed at or raise any eyebrows. So more people need to be embracing it, because there's a hell of a lot of talent out there that people are just quite simply missing out on. And yes, we'll do a deep dive on the 9th of October, so I hope people can join us for that. But what I'm really interested in terms of your journey, Chris, is how do you feel that your acceptance and your confidence with your condition, dyslexia, has helped your journey? And much like what Sophie and Zoe were saying about being women or being from different places or having different experiences, how do you feel you being confident about that has helped you in terms of your responsibility as a spokesperson for neurodiversity now?
Good question. Again, I'm going to link back to the word in Sophie used at the start of the call, which I absolutely love, is fire in the belly. You know, I've just got the fire in my belly. I'm obviously working on something I'm so passionate about in terms of supporting people who were in the exact same boat as I was to actually go and get those opportunities, get the same experiences and opportunities as their classmates. But I'm obviously very open and honest about talking about my dyslexia, but a lot of people aren't. And I think that is a big problem, is so many people don't even know they have a disability. And if they do declare that they do have a disability, you know, they might feel that they're going to have a black mark next against them by their employer. But in terms of my experience as an entrepreneur with dyslexia, again, just linking back to the chat earlier, you know, you embrace who you are. You know, you embrace that, you know, we have to work harder than, you know, like the rest of society, I guess, or we just need to have to really work harder. I can embrace the fact that I'm dyslexic, that 1 in 3 people with, or 1 in 3 entrepreneurs are dyslexic, and it is this superpower, having this creativity, this kind of problem solving skills. I think you just need to really embrace your diversity and just make it your thing.
So in terms of inclusion in the workplace, you know, all 3 of you guys are now founders. You've got teams I know, Chris, you've been hiring like crazy throughout the pandemic. How do you guys, in terms of practical tips, take your values based on the experiences that you've all had and create an inclusive culture within your company? Is that something that you've consciously done? We'll maybe start with Zoe on that.
Yes, definitely. I think for me, the main thing is what I said before, which is this rule of assumptions that we have in the business. And for me, that is important because we create the space that people don't come with assumptions. So we test every assumption we make. And that goes with the business, but also what we make for each other. I think the main thing for me is the openness, creating a space of openness and create a space of being able to listen to each other. And I think that what we're trying to do is that, you know, we don't, it kind of like embracing diversity means that you don't pay attention to the things that they don't matter. You pay attention to the things that matter. And I think for me is all about how we can work with people to make that work for the business rather than being, oh, you know, this is strange. I don't understand why that's happening. So openness, no making any assumptions. I think it's kind of like even that, like we have people from Europe in the team that are quite direct. I don't like the assumption because I've experienced that. I don't want the assumption, oh, they're rude or they don't know how to say that. This is just the acceptance of this is who they are. People who learn differently. And I think it's just being open to understand everyone and to understand that you might need to adapt your own style, your own leadership, your own way of doing things to make sure that everyone has an opinion, everyone has a voice, and everyone can bring things to the table.
So Sophie, what's happened in terms of your leadership? Because you worked in agency and you said, you know, you didn't like the culture in a lot of agencies. How have you managed to flip that in the creative sector?
Yeah, so I, just before COVID, actually recruited 3 members of the team, so all in one go. So for a small business, a huge influx of team. And the one thing that I really was passionate about was I needed to live these values. You know, I think we've all kind of been there and you get given that these are our values and they don't mean anything. And you know, I've worked in places where, you know, you have this fancy, you know, starter pack that HR give you. But what do these values mean in person? And for me, you know, I had to be able to show my team proactively that I believe in these things because I'm doing them myself. And then by them seeing me live there, then they'll be like, okay, this is actually true. So things like, you know, making sure that I didn't actively overwork, because if I'm saying I respect people's lives, they've got to see me respect my life. If I'm saying I respect flexible working, they've got to see me respect flexible working. If I'm saying I want people to bring their passions to work, they've got to see me bring my passions to work, you know, honoring that that person isn't just a job specification, they're actually a person. So what we did is we had these Friday catch-ups during COVID. So before COVID, we would meet up in Tantrum Donuts in Glasgow. So even though we're based in Edinburgh, all of the team were from Glasgow. So once a week, we'd meet up in Tantrum's Donuts and we would just have a chat. And I think it's just so important because that isn't there, because in the agency world, the creative sector, and most of the time is money. If you're not having billable hours, which means that, you know, every hour has to be billed for, so you lose your identity as an individual because you're just like, I'm just here to make money for you. So taking the team out outside of the office in Tantrum Donuts, just talking, allow them to see that I value them as individuals. And then when COVID came, we then turned that onto online Friday breakfast chat, bring breakfast, and we would just talk about one thing that we're really proud of and one thing that we found a struggle. I would be doing that as well. And I think it humanizes leadership because it shows them that, you know, leadership struggle as well. They're humans as well. I think that's so important for creating a workplace where everyone feels like they have something to play. So we would do that. And yeah, so one thing we all struggled with, one thing we felt we were proud of this week. I think it's just nice for humanizing the workforce, because I think sometimes you come in and you're just a number, especially in the creative sector, you're just your skills. You know, if you're a great graphic designer, if you're a great coder, you're just this job. And I just wanted them to know that I respect them as complex, varied individuals who are more than their job.
I think that's incredible to carve out that time.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly, Chris, before we move on, how have you, when you've been hiring staff remotely, I know you're sat in the office now, How have you been able to instill the values and kind of inclusive practices when you are a remote team now?
So we've actually hired 10 throughout lockdown, which is quite a lot of new faces. And you know, like I think what we just kind of constantly come back to is our core values, which you touched upon there, Sophie. And I think for me, I spent a hell of a lot of time with my two kind of my leadership team, Karen and Ewan, both joined roughly about 18 months ago, and they're literally like co-founders now. And I've run everything past those guys, but it's not just me that's the leader in this company now. So we have 3 leaders, and basically what we just really focused hard on within that recruitment process was making sure people had the same skills, the same interests, the same drivers and passions that we do as a company. Obviously, for us, everything relates back to my story as to why I needed support. So accessibility is one of our core values. The other thing that I feel like is super important, again, Sophie, you've touched upon it briefly, but actually being very, very visible as leaders and never asking anyone to do a job that you wouldn't do yourself. So the second of our kind of core values is adaptability. And so what we'd be looking for is our team and as a company for us to be adaptable. Ambition is the next. So that's us wanting to set the benchmark for accessibility standards for us to be the best individuals that we can as well, to constantly grow. And the final one is attainment, and that is constant learning. So when we are interviewing, we want to see people hitting those kind of 4 key kind of pillars that we have kind of created as this company. So we want to see people who have a passion for, you know, social causes, or if it's accessibility, even better, but showing strong empathy. Adaptability, we want to be able to see people with transferable skills and folk who would, for example, a question is, you know, what would you do if you see that the milk's running low in the office? Would you go and buy more, or would you just kind of leave that someone else's job? Ambition is looking at what the hunger, what the fire in the belly is to actually go and improve. And then attainment, you know, what CPD, what are you interested in outside of work? How do you actually grow as an individual? We have like a reading allowance, we have all sorts of CPD budget and support, but we actually have a daily drumbeat every single morning where we talk about our days. We have our one-to-ones on a Friday, but one of the big things is looking at how we can actually help each other, what we can learn from each other, because we have a very diverse group. And age, for example, is a really big thing. We've got team members from 21 all the way up through to sort of mid-60s, and it's just everyone's learning from different people. Like we have our marketing team sitting in on sprint meetings, we have devs sitting in on kind of like the creative sessions to see what can you actually learn from separate aspects of that. But just having those kind of core pillars, I think, was really important with that actual recruitment process. And everyone's been brilliant, to be honest. We've not even met half of the new hires in person.
Well, I think it's interesting that you know, those are all practical takeaways that people in this audience can do. And when you are a startup and every pound is a prisoner, you've got this war on talent, and the conversation is always not just how can we bring people in with our values and our flashy office, but what can we give them, which is more than just financial remuneration. And that's your culture, that's your personal development opportunities, you know, it's the chance for them to be themselves and bring them whole selves to work. So I think this is something that we can all do and try and be mindful of, but think about new and innovative ways of reaching people and making them feel included when we all are working from home. The elephant in the room tonight has been kind of Black Lives Matter that we've not had a chance to properly delve into. So before we move to the Q&A, Martine, could you kick us off with that?
Sure. We've actually talked about it, but actually not really in depth. So definitely Black Lives Matter has prompted the work of many businesses to look at their cultures, their business practices, their hiring processes as we're talking, their brand values. And for many, it was a time to listen and learn. But then for others, probably like me, for instance, who had grown up with racism, you know, as a constant part of our identity, it was more of a time to speak up and be heard, because as I was saying, this conversation were most of the time brushed under the carpet. And so I would love to ask my first question to Sophie, and because I think I've seen posts on social media about like Black Lives Matter, and so I want to to understand how do you feel this experience of Black Lives Matter movement impacted you personally and professionally, and if you felt a responsibility to speak up.
Yeah, so I think all of us felt the reverberal waves all around the world. And for me personally, I felt, so I'm also on the BEMA, which is the British Interactive Media Association. I'm on their Diversity and Inclusion Council. And I felt this personal responsibility because of what I do at work. I also run a social media agency, so I'm constantly online and managing brand accounts. There was nowhere to hide from what happened, and my immediate response was, you just want to step up to this. You're like, I have to represent these voices. But then I think the reality is for a lot of Black people or people of color, you're also having to face your own trauma in this. You're facing what you've gone through in your own life. So not only is the burden to speak up on your shoulders, you're also having the burden of facing your own traumas. And, you know, me and friends who, you know, had never spoken about this, were telling stories about things that happen in the workplace, outside of the workplace. And there is this collective weight to fix the problem and talk about the problem. I think there was a time where I realized that I could not take the weight of this responsibility, and I had to stop. I just had to come offline. I had to put it back down, because I think what people don't realize is for a lot of Black and people of color, this is something you've lived your whole life, but to get on with life, you push it down. You push it down and you just get on with it. And I think what happened with Black Lives Matter is at first we were like, finally, people get it. People get that, you know, this is real. But then after a while, a lot of people and activists that I was talking about, other people on the BEMA Council, were like, this is actually a lot for us to do by ourselves. But the great thing I found was that people who weren't of color were listening, and they took that time to say, we want to listen to what you have to say. It was great because as a team, we were able to talk about it. Clients, you know, I had clients on the phone, you know, like tech companies who were like, you know, acknowledging their privilege, a conversation which I would have never expected to have, you know, clients saying, you know, I acknowledge my personal privilege, you know. So I think it was great that it forced people to listen. But I think the reality is that what I've always imagined would happen was on social media, there was this initial upwave, and then it would slowly die out. People would stop talking about it. It would move on to something else. And I think for me, as a business owner, the first thing was acknowledging that it's okay to step back, Sophie. You don't have to do all the fighting. You don't have to be on the front line. Take a step back, look after your own mental health, deal with your own traumas in this, take some time out. And I think one thing that I would love everyone to take away as well is to understand the experiences that people of color have gone through their whole lives, and imagine having to face that so publicly as well. It's a lot for a lot of people. And I think in terms of my business, it's been transformative, because now I'm speaking to businesses about the very things that at first are like, we don't have the budget for that. I'm like, how can you diversify your social media? Now they understand the importance of it. It's a shame that it took that for them to understand why diversity is important. But I'm glad that the conversation happened. And me personally, I'm going to knock on some doors and ask for answers. I need receipts. You said that you were going to pledge to do these things. You know, I was on ScotGov Parliament TV the other day, just watching what was happening in the debating chambers. Fantastic to see Scottish government talk about the human rights of ethnic minorities, something the English government are not doing. So I think in Scotland, we're in a unique position where our government does want to address these issues. And they were talking about things from, like, you know, changing the curriculum so that we are talking about Black history. We are changing this narrative of the West being fantastic and having no problems. So I think it's great that Scottish government are opening the platform for this. And I hope, you know, that was yesterday, just after Nicola Sturgeon's announcement. So this is months after. So I'm actually really proud, you know, despite my experiences, I'm really proud of Scotland, that Scotland wants to have these conversations. They're not pushing it under the carpet like I fear England is doing. And they are saying there is a problem. How can we address it? And I think anyone that's starting a startup now's your time to offer solutions to Scottish Government and hopefully allow the interest in this to hopefully give you, hopefully, the business support that you need to address these issues.
Nice. I would then move on probably to ask Zoe on the other side, because I know that Future X Plus has a community and which includes a lot of business leaders from around the world. And I wanted to know how this Black Lives Matter movement was received by the community.
Definitely. I think obviously we experienced that from a different side. I think for me, the main thing was, like personally, was exactly as Sophie said, acknowledging my privilege. And I think it was such a massive moment when that happened, and taking the time to really learn and understand and have this conversation. And it's something that I keep doing, because I feel that was my fear. Like I always have this thing when things happen and then we forget. And I've kind of like want to make sure that this doesn't happen, because it's not what it is. I think the way it was approached with the community was a lot of conversations. There was people who were dealing with that with different ways. There were people who were jumping in, we're having conversations, we're trying to do this with our team. These are some things that we tried out, how to bring up the conversations, how to kind of like break down barriers. But we also have people who are like, I just want to take a step back. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to find the best solution. But I think the part of having a community is bringing all these different voices together and be able to help each other to understand more. What we've done as a business, which for me was brilliant, is we had a conversation as a team to understand what we all feel and to understand all the different learnings we have and how can we pull these resources together. And we pledged to focus more on that. And I think for me, that was the big thing, is this idea that when we put our focus and attention onto something, it happens. 2 years ago, we said we wanted 50-50 gender diversity in our event. And then it happened because it was on our mind. And it was like, it's so simple. Is the thing that if you let it happen, it might never. But if you really put your attention and focus on it, you actually try hard to engage with that and try hard to put that as the forefront of your situation. So for me, it's all bringing all these conversations. What we're trying to do in the community is to not forget this. This is not a topical theme that happened then, and now we moved on to other things. Is how we can continue having that and how we can actively do things. But the most important is to also engage everyone who has solutions. As Sophie said, because I come from a place that I don't know what to do. I don't know what is best, and I want to learn what is best. And having this conversation and know how we can bring the solutions to the table.
Well said. Sophie, final thought on this topic before we move on, because I'm conscious of time. How do you feel that society and the people who are on the other side of this lived experience of racism, how can we help take the responsibility of having these conversations away from the Black voices? You mentioned your own fatigue. How can this conversation keep going without the onus having to be on Black champions all the time?
It's such a great question. And I think if we can all just do what we can within our small personal circles, because that's where opinions are shaped, within our friendship groups, our circles, to have these tough discussions with friends and family members. That's where real change happens. It's within our intimate relationships that we have with one another. And that is not done online, that's done offline. That's access to spaces that we don't have. And if people can start having those open conversations, over the dinner table, educating children in the classroom, like our intimate family and friendship circles, if we can have these tough conversations, I think that's where people who don't have that lived experience can really create some real impact. Because if I'm saying it as a Black woman, of course I would say it, it hurts me the most. But if, for example, a white male or white female is saying it to their friends or their family, it's like, okay, wow, okay, I get it, because this person believes in it. So I think it's the conversations that we have in everyday life. I remember a very poignant incident when I was on the bus going through Edinburgh, and there was I can't remember, I don't want to assume what race she was, but there was somebody who wasn't Indigenous to Scotland who was sitting on the bus, and a man was shouting abuse at her, and this woman just got up and she went, I can't do a Scottish accent, I really wish I could, I've been here 5 years, but she got up and she said, every person is welcome in Scotland. If you have a problem with that, get off this bus. And it just felt great to see someone speak up. And now I'm not asking everyone to start shouting on the bus, but if every person could have a difficult conversation, and it could be in your own family, it could be a neighbor, I think collectively that's where real change happens. When you study the civil rights movement, the real success wasn't at the protests. They had a great, powerful impact. It was a conversation that people were having behind closed doors. And it's those that change minds, because just like Brexit, the Brexit voters are like us. They have families, they have friends, and they have been fed lies. A lot of them have been indoctrinated. And I think it's to be a real advocate, have those difficult conversations for us in your personal relationships.
If the panel could make one change or want organizations to make one change, what would that be?
Yeah, and that's from Paul Scotland.
To be more inclusive. So that will go into the question of Andy. So what's one change that organization can make to be more inclusive? One.
Who wants to start with that?
Okay.
So he's got her hand up.
I know. I don't know why. It's the first thing that came to mind. So I'll go for it. I think for me is to create a space to have these difficult conversations. I think if there is one thing, is create the space and have conversations to be able to move forward.
Perfect. Chris?
I would be focusing in on unconscious bias in the interview process and trying to create an environment which is as neutral and, as personal as, say, for example, someone with a disability, or, it could be even based on the name of someone who's applied for a job. I think it really has to just look at everyone as having that same, or trying to provide the same kind of, from day one, and building that throughout the whole kind of culture, is actually just trying to support people, rather than, how do they tick this box, in terms of, is this something that, do they fit our criteria? Do they have, first class honours degree, whatever else? I think it's just trying to create that interview process which allows anyone to apply.
Love that. Sophie, one change to make the workplace more inclusive?
Oh, wow, tough question. I would say history. Study history together, watch documentaries as a team. A great book I'm reading is Small is Beautiful, A Study of Economics as If People Matter. A great book for people to read. I think things like this, read a book together and discuss it, watch a documentary. I think when we talk about CPD, we ignore learning about history, repeat it. So I think if businesses could find a way to interweave into their learning.
Oh no. Oh no, you lost some of that answer, Sophie. That's so frustrating, because you were on such
Sophie's on mute.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking. Sophie, you got muted there just when you were on your soapbox. Please finish that thought.
Yes, yeah, and the point was, if we forget history, we're likely to repeat history. And I think if you look at Germany, they're a fantastic example of, every school child learns about the atrocities of the Holocaust, how that came.
You got muted again, Sophie. How heartbreaking. Okay, we'll do our last question from Anna, and we'll try to let Sophie have her moment. The powers that be at Zoom are trying to silence the black voices. We can't have that here.
The moment you mentioned history,
they don't want us to know. So the last question is from Anna. She's asking, what is one thing about your identity that you felt that you had to alter or quieten to be more inclusive?
Wow, we'll start with Zoe for that one.
Just because I put my hand up before.
Yeah.
Okay, I think being direct. I think that was one of the things that I grew up being very direct. I still enjoy it. I enjoy when I have very direct conversations, but I've learned to change the way I communicate my opinions and my thoughts and my feedback to make sure that I don't come across as rude and people can accept what I'm saying.
Perfect. Chris?
Probably perseverance. I think with dyslexia, I think it's easy for me to kind of, when things get going, you know, as a child, I would have just kind of thrown the toys not thrown the toys at the pram, but, you know, given up quite easily if things weren't going my way. And so I think it just came down to actually really trying to change that mindset and really focusing in on perseverance to absolutely nail whatever jobs in front of your disability.
Okay. And Sophie, one thing that you felt you had to quieten or alter to be more included?
Yeah, so I definitely felt that there was this stereotype of being, you know, a loud Black woman. But that's just who I am. If I was born white, I would still be just as loud, to be honest. To be honest with you, I'm just a loud person. But I have learned to sometimes tone it down, to bring people with me. I think that's so important. It's horrible that you have to do that, but I think sometimes it's more important to bring people with you than leave them out of the conversations. If I can make that little sacrifice to bring someone with me, I will.
I love that. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up, guys. We have danced around this issue quite a bit, but it feels now, you know, as lockdown restrictions were lifting, we're now looking at another lockdown. I mentioned before the lessons that we've had from the pandemic, the lessons that we've had from the big conversations around civil rights. What, in one sentence each, do you feel are the opportunities we can take from 2020 for a more inclusive society? And we'll start with whoever's brave. I think Zoe's my go-to brave person. So.
I feel like in my screen, I'm next to you,
Yeah.
so it's an automatic. I think for me it's the solidarity, this feeling that we are similar and we are we can deal with something. There is kind of, you know, sometimes you need an external enemy, and it's this feeling that we are fighting for something together. And as we said before, we're not equal in this. We have a lot of different backgrounds, but also we have a lot of different superpowers to bring to the table. So for me, there is an opportunity to understand that we are fighting together and come together to bring the solutions.
Okay, love that. Chris, positive opportunity for societal change from this year?
I think it's empathy and just understanding kind of, you know, you gave that lovely metaphor earlier. You know, we aren't all in the same boat. You know, we might be on the same journey or struggling with the same thing, but everyone has different circumstances, and it is just trying to relate and understand that, you know, someone might not be okay, for example, or someone's struggling, but just trying to, and again, linking into Zoe's kind of key message was, we can't just assume that everyone is always going to constantly be okay. So it is just having that empathy, that understanding and patience.
That wasn't one sentence, but I'll let you off because you credited my metaphor. Zoe, what final thought on positive opportunities from this year? Don't tell me I muted again.
I'd probably say that we're better off together, and that's in every sense of the word: economically, societally, emotionally, mentally, physically. We're just better off together.
That's a great message. Okay, folks, thank you for bearing with us. I know we've covered a lot of ground. We're going to be chopping this up and sending it out. A huge thank you to our panel tonight: Chris Hughes, Zoe Candidato, and Sophie Amundo. Folks, do any of you have anything you want to talk about or promote about what you're excited about at the moment?
I just want to promote the book again, because I think it could be cut off. Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. It was written in the 70s. And the point I was making about history is, if we forget history, we're going to repeat it. And when you look at Germany, all children learn about the Holocaust and the atrocities that happened, not because of to shame them, but if we forget what's happened in history. So my plug is anyone that wants to chat to me. I love a good chat. If you're in and around Edinburgh, Glasgow, if you want a donut, you just want to hang out, just drop me a line.
That's amazing. Anything for you, Zoe, at Future X?
I would probably say the same. I think that has been a very interesting conversation. I think this is time to continue unpicking these themes. So let's keep having these conversations. If anyone wants to chat, if anyone has good ideas, good things that they're doing, please send our way. I think this is kind of like, as Sophie said, like we're better together. It's also better to like keep promoting each other and the work that we're doing. So I think let's keep up this conversation.
Absolutely, and the Future X Plus community is a great one to join to as a forum to have those conversations, I think. Chris, anything at present, pal?
No, I guess what a nice kind of message to kind of end on is with Skills Development Scotland, there's a nice new kind of neurodiversity report coming out, which will be getting launched at Scotsoft early October, which I'm presenting just after Kate Forbes. Nice to be name drop. Which there's some really interesting information in there, and I would just encourage folk to just, I think it's just an education piece on all sorts of areas in diversity and inclusion generally. I think
Absolutely.
we're having this conversation, so that's brilliant, but just like Sophie said, I think it's just really important that we take this conversation further and kind of push boundaries and have these kind of awkward conversations with our teammates, with our friends, with our family.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Martine. This is your first time in the driver's seat. You did an excellent job, my friend. Thank you for Alan for recording. And I'd just like to finish with a final thought from social commentator Jay-Z, who says, "Identity is a prison you can never escape, but the way to redeem your past is not to run from it, but to try to understand it and to use it as a foundation to grow." So I hope we've all had some time to reflect and can think about how our own identities are superpowers that can take us forward. Thanks again to our panel, and I hope everyone has a great evening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.